I always knew my grandmother was different. Not eccentric in a charming way, not flamboyant or flamboyantly wise like some old women in the movies, but quietly strange. Her world smelled of mothballs and peppermint lozenges, her cupboards were lined with old tins that rattled with coins and bits of string. Her house was a mausoleum of the past, cluttered with chipped porcelain figurines and faded photographs of people whose names I could never remember. I was 24 when I finally snapped at her. I suppose I could blame it on the stress, the unpaid internship that wasn't leading anywhere, the roommate who hadn't paid rent in 3 months, my boyfriend who said he'd come to my birthday dinner but forgot. Maybe it was all of that. Or maybe I was just tired of pretending to be grateful for what felt like trash. It happened on my birthday. She shuffled into my apartment, leaning on that cracked wooden cane, the one with a rubber tip that squeaked on my laminate floors. She handed me a cardboard box wrapped in reused floral paper. The edges were worn thin, the tape yellowed like old teeth. I forced a smile and thanked her, but inside my chest I felt that familiar coil of resentment tighten. "Open it now, dear," she said, eyes watery, mouth quivering with a hopeful smile. So I did. I peeled back the brittle paper, lifted the cardboard flaps. Inside was a mess, a tangled heap of knitted scarves, a pair of costume earrings with missing stones, a yellowed doily, and a faded silk handkerchief embroidered with violets. I felt my cheeks burn. I pressed my lips into a line, trying not to let the words out, but they came anyway. "Why do you always give me this junk, Grandma?" Her smile froze. She looked at me, blinking like a startled owl. "Junk?" "Yes. Junk. Every year, old scarves, broken jewelry, doilies. I don't want any of this. Why can't you just—" "I don't know, give me something normal? Or don't give me anything at all." The silence that fell after my outburst was thick and sticky, like the air before a thunderstorm. She opened her mouth to say something, but closed it again. Her lower lip trembled. Then, very slowly, she nodded. "I see," she said, her voice thin as tissue paper. I don't know what I expected, an argument, a lecture, maybe tears. But she only stood there, shoulders hunched forward, her cane trembling in her hand. She looked so small in my kitchen, surrounded by my modern things, the glass table, the chrome kettle, the white IKEA shelves that were already starting to sag. I wanted to say something to fix it. But pride is a hard stone to spit out. So I didn't. She left without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. I stood alone, staring at the open box on my table, at the scraps of her world I had rejected. 4 months afterward, I didn't call her. She didn't call me either. We lived in the same city but might as well have been continents apart. I'd see her number pop up on my phone and let it ring out. Sometimes she'd leave messages, quiet, hesitant ones. "Hello, sweetheart, it's me. Just wondering if you're all right." I'd delete them without listening to the end. I told myself she was old-fashioned, that she didn't understand me, that she never did. My friends would laugh when I showed them the earrings missing stones, the threadbare scarves that smelled like mothballs. "She probably picked that stuff up at a garage sale," they'd say, and I'd laugh too, though sometimes my throat would tighten afterward in a way I couldn't quite explain. I didn't go see her that Christmas. Or Easter. Or on Mother's Day. I told myself I was busy. That she didn't need me. That she probably didn't even notice. But of course, she did. When the call came, it was from my mother. Grandma had fallen in the garden behind her little house, the house with the overgrown roses and the rusting gate. The paramedics said it was quick. My mother said the same thing, over and over on the phone. "It was quick, honey. It was quick." I sat in my apartment, staring at the cardboard box still tucked under my bed. I hadn't thrown it away, though I told myself I would. Something about it, the way it sat there, half forgotten, made it easier to ignore the guilt. Now it stared back at me like an accusation. I pulled it out, sat cross-legged on my carpet, and lifted the lid again. There they were, the scarves, the cheap earrings, the doily, the silk handkerchief. They smelled like her. Lavender and old wood and the peppermint lozenges she always carried in her purse. I pressed the handkerchief to my face. It was soft. Softer than I remembered. I didn't cry. I wish I could say I did, that I wept right there on my floor, that I whispered apologies into the faded silk. But I didn't. My eyes stayed dry, my heart stubbornly clenched. Regret sat on my chest like a stone gargoyle, unmoving, unblinking. At her funeral, I stood beside my mother and stared at the polished mahogany coffin. People said nice things. They called her generous, kind, wise. I clenched my fists and wondered which grandmother they were talking about. The one who gave me broken jewelry? The one who left me scraps of cloth like a pigeon leaving twigs? After the wake, I went back to her house for the first time in years. The roses in the front garden had grown wild, twisting around the rusted gate like a crown of thorns. Inside, everything was just as I remembered: dark wood furniture, doilies on every surface, photographs of people who were now just shadows in old frames. I sat in her armchair, the one with the floral upholstery worn thin at the arms. I looked around at the shelves stacked with tin boxes, old teacups, glass jars full of buttons and coins. I thought about the box under my bed. The scarves, the earrings, the handkerchief. I thought about the way her face had fallen when I called her gifts junk. I didn't know it then, but the truth, the real truth, was hidden in those scraps. A secret folded into the soft silk and tangled threads. A secret I wouldn't discover until I finally decided to look closer. I spent that night at Grandma's house, curled up under a faded patchwork quilt on the old couch. The silence there was different, not like my apartment's buzzing fridge and humming pipes, but deep, layered, like the house itself was still breathing in her absence. In the morning, sunlight leaked through the lace curtains, catching on floating dust motes. I woke up stiff, my neck crooked from the couch's lumpy cushions. The air smelled faintly of lavender sachets and wood polish, the same comforting, musty scent that used to cling to her sweaters. I wandered through the rooms, trailing my fingers along dark oak furniture. Her house had always felt like a museum, full of relics nobody but her knew how to read. Each drawer seemed to hold a lifetime of scraps, receipts from decades ago, hairpins, scraps of ribbon, brittle photographs in cracked frames. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe proof that I'd been right. That she really had nothing to give but old junk and stale memories. Or maybe I was hoping to find something that would make me feel less monstrous for what I'd said. In the dining room, I found a box just like the one she'd given me, the same cheap cardboard, the same faded wrapping paper, reused so many times it had lost its color. It sat on the sideboard under a crocheted runner, tucked behind a chipped porcelain vase full of dried roses. Inside were more scarves. More trinkets. Another pair of earrings, these shaped like tiny flowers, one petal bent. A handkerchief embroidered with bluebells this time, not violets. I sank into one of the stiff-backed dining chairs and laid the things out in front of me. The silk felt fragile, the threads so delicate they shimmered when I tilted them toward the light. What was she doing? Hoarding these things like a magpie? Or was it just her way of holding on to a world that was slipping through her fingers? I found more boxes in the bedroom. One in her wardrobe, under the bottom shelf where her old coats hung heavy with the scent of cedar. Another tucked under her bed, pushed so far back I had to lie flat on my stomach and fish it out with a broom handle. Each one the same: scarves, costume jewelry, handkerchiefs, scraps of lace, odd little keepsakes. I piled them on her bedspread, surrounded by the smell of her rose-scented talcum powder. The heap looked ridiculous, a dragon's hoard of worthless fabric and broken trinkets. And then, tucked into the corner of one box, I found something different, a small brass key wrapped in tissue. No note. No hint at what it might open. Just a key, cold and smooth in my palm. I held it up to the light. The metal was worn shiny at the edges, as if it had been turned in some lock many times. It didn't look like a house key, too delicate, too old-fashioned. A jewelry box? A drawer? A safe? I went back through her bedroom, searching for locks I'd never noticed. The drawers in her dresser were all unlocked. The wardrobe, too. The little nightstand with its cracked porcelain knob held nothing but more sachets of lavender, old pill bottles, half-finished crossword puzzles in the local paper. Then I remembered the attic. The attic door was hidden in the hallway ceiling, a square of cracked plaster with a frayed pull cord. As a child, I'd hated the attic, the creaking ladder, the smell of dust and dry wood, the shifting shadows. I hadn't been up there in years. I dragged a chair over, tugged the cord, and the trapdoor creaked open, dust sifting down like powdered sugar. The fold-out ladder resisted at first, then lurched down with a shriek. The air up there was stifling, hot and dry even in spring, thick with that smell of old timber and forgotten things. Sunlight speared in through a tiny round window, illuminating a cluttered sea of boxes, trunks, and moth-eaten blankets. I climbed slowly, each step protesting under my weight. The floorboards creaked under my sneakers. I moved aside old trunks, stacks of yellowed newspapers tied with string, a rocking horse with half its mane chewed off by moths or mice. Then, near the far wall, half buried under a moldy patchwork quilt, I saw it, a small wooden chest, about the size of a suitcase. Dark wood, brass corners tarnished green. And a keyhole, small and old-fashioned. My heart skittered as I knelt beside it. I unwrapped the key from its tissue and pressed it into the lock. It slid in perfectly, turned with a soft click. The lid creaked open, hinges sighing like an old door. Inside, the first thing I saw was another scarf, deep burgundy silk, embroidered with tiny gold threads. But when I lifted it, something heavier shifted beneath. Bundles of fabric-wrapped parcels. Small velvet pouches tied with faded ribbons. I pulled one open, my fingers trembling. A string of pearls, heavy and real, cool against my skin. Not the cheap plastic beads I'd always imagined, but real pearls, lustrous, uneven, alive. I opened another parcel. A brooch, intricate gold filigree studded with emeralds that winked in the dim attic light. Rings, 2, old, heavy rings, set with stones the size of marbles. Coins and cloth rolls, old banknotes so crisp they crackled when I unfolded them. It felt like a punch to the chest. I sat back on my heels, surrounded by riches disguised as rags. My grandmother's junk. She'd hidden them in plain sight, wrapped them in scarves, tucked them into handkerchiefs, hidden them inside boxes no one would bother to look through. Her way of passing them on without the rest of the family knowing. I thought of all the times I'd sneered at her gifts, all the times I'd called her things worthless. She must have heard every word and stayed silent, watching me reject the treasure she'd disguised as scraps. I pressed my face into my hands, but the tears wouldn't come. Just a hollow ache, echoing in the attic silence. Downstairs, the house waited. Dust floated in the sunbeams like tiny ghosts. The treasures lay in my lap, heavy and brilliant and bitter all at once. I sat there for a long time, the key still warm in my palm, wishing I could unlock something else, something buried deeper than this chest of secrets. I spent hours in that attic, surrounded by dust and shadows and the weight of things I'd never bothered to see. The treasure chest sat open like a wound, spilling velvet and silk and gold across the warped floorboards. The sunlight through the tiny window shifted as the hours passed, turning the pearls from creamy white to dusky gray. I held each piece up to the light, tracing the cool curves of the jewelry, the intricate settings, the delicate clasps. These weren't trinkets you'd find at a garage sale. They were heirlooms, maybe older than my grandmother herself. Passed down through hands that had known wars and weddings, famine and feasts. And she had given them to me, piece by piece, hidden in scarves and doilies I had mocked. When my knees ached too much to stay on the floor, I dragged the chest downstairs. Each step down the attic ladder felt like a confession, the old wood creaking under the truth I'd ignored for so long. In the living room, I spread it all out on her lace-covered coffee table. The pearls, the brooches, the rings that glowed under the dusty afternoon light. The coins and crisp banknotes, faded but real. I sat back on her floral couch, the same one I used to sprawl on as a child, and stared at the heap of hidden riches. My phone buzzed on the armrest, a message from my mother, checking in. I ignored it. Instead, I went back into her bedroom. There were still boxes I hadn't opened. Drawers I hadn't searched properly. If Grandma had hidden her treasures this carefully, what else might be waiting? I found another key, smaller than the attic chest key, taped to the underside of her dresser drawer. This one was bronze, its teeth oddly shaped. I turned it over in my fingers, feeling the weight of the metal. A faint thrill of dread curled in my stomach, like the house itself was holding its breath. I combed through the bedroom, the hallway, the spare room where she'd kept old blankets and sewing supplies. And then, behind a stack of hat boxes in her closet, I noticed a small wall panel. A square of painted wood, slightly lighter than the rest of the wall. I tapped it, hollow. I slid my fingernails into the seam and pried it loose. It came away with a reluctant creak, revealing a tiny built-in safe. Its brass dial gleamed dully in the dim light. My pulse drummed in my ears as I slipped the small key into the lock beneath the dial. It turned with a sharp click. I held my breath, pulled the door open. Inside, stacked in neat rows, were envelopes. Yellowed, brittle, each one tied with faded twine. My name was on the top envelope, written in her slanted, looping script. My throat tightened as I sat cross-legged on the floor and opened it. "My darling girl," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you found what I tried to leave for you quietly. I hope you understand, someday, why I did it this way. I read the words twice before they sank in. Her handwriting danced across the page, so familiar it made my chest ache. I could almost hear her voice, soft and patient, reading over my shoulder. I know our family. I know what they would do if they knew what I had saved. They'd fight like crows over scraps, tearing each other apart. So I chose you, my stubborn, bright, sharp-tongued girl. I trusted you to find what others wouldn't look for. To see what others wouldn't see. I pictured her eyes, pale, watery, always searching my face for something I never bothered to give. I saw the quiver of her mouth when I'd called her gifts worthless. I know you thought they were nothing. And I forgive you for that. It was never about the scarves or the earrings. It was about hiding what mattered inside what looked like nothing. I wanted you to have this without the fighting, the jealousy. I wanted you to have something of mine, of ours. Something no one could take from you. My fingers trembled as I turned the page. Spend it, keep it, sell it, I don't care what you do. Just remember, my girl, not everything precious shines on the surface. Some treasures need dust and shadows to stay safe. Some treasures need time to be understood. I let the letter fall into my lap. The room seemed too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive, like the walls were listening. I read through the other envelopes. They were older, letters to my mother, my uncle, distant cousins. Instructions, apologies, secrets spelled out in careful lines. She'd planned it all, like a general mapping her final campaign. I sat on the floor until my legs went numb, the letters spread around me like fallen leaves. I thought about how many times I dismissed her. How quick I'd been to roll my eyes at her musty boxes and knotted silk scarves. I rose slowly, the safe door still open behind me. I gathered the letters into a neat pile, pressed my palm flat on top as if I could feel her pulse in the paper. In the kitchen, I made tea the way she used to, loose leaves, no bag, poured through her dented little strainer into a chipped porcelain cup. I sat at her table in the chair she always claimed for herself, the one closest to the window. Outside, the garden was overgrown. Roses spilled wildly over the fence. Weeds sprouted between cracked paving stones. I wondered how long she'd tended that garden, waiting for me to come back. Waiting for me to see. I sipped the tea, bitter and strong. The old clock on the mantel ticked away the quiet minutes. A fly buzzed lazily at the window. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked once, then fell silent. In the middle of that stillness, I realized how small my anger had always been. How loud my pride. And how quietly she'd carried her secrets, right in front of me. I finished my tea and rinsed the cup in her chipped porcelain sink. I dried it carefully, the way she used to. I placed it back on its shelf, lined up perfectly with its mismatched sisters. Then I went back to the living room, where the pearls and emeralds glowed on the coffee table like echoes of a life I'd ignored. I sat beside them, running my fingers over the strands and stones, letting the dust cling to my skin. In her silence, in her secrecy, my grandmother had left me more than an inheritance. She'd left me a lesson I hadn't deserved but needed anyway. And there was still more to find. More whispers in the walls, waiting to be heard. I spent the next few days drifting through her house like a ghost. I slept under the same quilt she'd wrapped around my shoulders when I was small, when fevers burned through my body and she stayed up all night with a damp cloth and whispered lullabies. I brewed her bitter black tea every morning, washed my face at her sink, opened the windows to let in the scent of her wild roses. The chest of treasure sat on the coffee table, covered now with a fresh white cloth. I couldn't look at it all the time, the glint of gold and pearls felt like a rebuke, a reminder of what I'd thrown back in her face. But I couldn't shut it away either. So I covered it, like you'd drape a cloth over a mirror during morning. On the third morning, I woke up early. Sunlight spilled through the lace curtains, patterning her wallpaper with shifting ghosts of flowers. I pulled on one of her old cardigans from the wardrobe, pale blue, sleeves a little too short, smelling faintly of lavender and old cedar. Then I stepped into the garden barefoot, feeling the dewy grass soak my soles. The roses were out of control, thick thorny canes clawing at the fence, blooms drooping heavy with rain and neglect. Bees buzzed among them, drunk on late spring nectar. I remembered trailing behind her as a child while she pruned them carefully, her gloved hands gentle despite the thorns. Near the rusted gate at the far end, a patch of earth looked freshly turned. Not by her, she hadn't been strong enough to garden for months before she died, my mother told me. Yet the soil was dark and crumbly, scattered with dry leaves. I crouched beside it, scraping the dirt with my fingernails. A root tangled around my wrist, thin and stubborn. I tugged it loose, and felt my fingers hit something hard. A tin. An old biscuit tin, its once colorful paint faded to gray. I hauled it out, dirt clinging to its sides, and sat back on my heels. Inside were more little cloth bundles. I opened one with trembling hands. More coins, gold sovereigns I recognized from pictures in history books. Another bundle held a roll of bills so old they looked like props from an antique shop. I counted them, hundreds, maybe thousands in faded currency. I looked around the garden, at the fence, the weeds, the roses. How many times had I laughed when she shuffled around this yard, claiming she was checking the roses? How many times had I brushed off her insistence on keeping her little patch of earth when the rest of the family wanted her to move into a modern apartment? I dug deeper, pushing my fingers through the damp soil, finding another tin, then a third. Small treasures planted like bulbs beneath the roses. Her own hidden orchard, bearing a harvest of secrets. Back inside, I stacked the tins next to the chest in the living room. The pile looked ridiculous, a dragon's hoard disguised in biscuit tins and scarves. I sat on the floor beside them, my back against her floral couch. The afternoon sun caught the dust in the air, turning it gold. I imagined her standing in the doorway, leaning on her cane, smiling that quiet smile that never asked for thanks. I heard the front door creak open. My mother's voice floated through the hallway. "Hello? Honey, are you here?" I didn't move. Part of me wanted to sweep everything back into its hiding places, to guard the secret she'd left just for me. But another part, the part that felt the weight of every unopened letter, every message I'd ignored, knew I couldn't keep it hidden forever. My mother stepped into the living room. She looked older than I remembered. Gray threaded through her dark hair, her hands fussed with a strap of her purse like they always did when she didn't know what to say. She saw the tins, the chest, the cloths peeled back to reveal gleaming stones and dull coins. "What is all this?" she asked softly. I swallowed. My tongue felt too big for my mouth. "It's Grandma's," I said. "She left it for me." My mother's eyes darted over the spread. I watched the truth settle into her face, the disbelief, the dawning understanding, the inevitable flicker of envy. But beneath it, there was something else. A crack of regret, maybe. A reflection of my own. I held out the envelope with my name, the first letter I'd found in the hidden safe. "She didn't want anyone to fight over it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She trusted me to find it." My mother sat down beside me on the floor, her neat skirt pulling around her knees. She took the letter but didn't open it. Instead, she looked at me, really looked, the way she hadn't since I was a teenager. "I always thought she was just hoarding old junk," my mother said. Her voice trembled. "I didn't know." "Neither did I," I said. "I didn't want to know." We sat like that for a long time, the two of us surrounded by velvet and silk and tarnished gold. Outside, the roses swayed against the fence, nodding their heavy heads in the breeze. My mother took my hand. Hers was smaller than I remembered, fragile, like a bird's wing. "I used to hate that garden," she said suddenly. "She made me help her weed it every weekend. Said the roses needed to be fed. I thought she was just being old-fashioned." "Maybe she was," I said, a small laugh catching in my throat. "In her own way." We sorted through the tins together. She didn't ask to keep anything. She didn't argue. Maybe she knew, deep down, that this was how Grandma wanted it, quiet, secret, tucked into the hands of the one person stubborn enough to dig it all up. As dusk fell, my mother left. She pressed her lips to my forehead at the door, something she hadn't done in years. When the door clicked shut behind her, the house seemed to breathe again. I went back to the garden. The roses rustled in the gathering dark, whispering secrets I hadn't heard before. Somewhere under the soil, I knew there were more tins, more secrets she'd planted in the earth for me to find. Not because she wanted to test me, but because she wanted me to understand that some treasures needed dirt and thorns to bloom. I sat on the back step until the stars came out, the damp grass cool against my feet, the scent of roses wrapping around me like her old cardigan. The garden gate creaked in the breeze, swinging gently on its rusted hinges, open, inviting me back inside a world I thought I'd outgrown. And for the first time I didn't feel angry at her anymore. I stayed in her house for a week after my mother left, wandering from room to room like a restless ghost. Every drawer, every shelf felt different now, not dusty or cluttered, but rich with hidden messages I'd missed for years. I found old ledgers in a drawer in her sewing room. Thick, heavy books with cracked leather spines and pages lined with careful numbers in her neat, looping script. It wasn't just jewelry and coins she'd hidden. She'd kept track of every penny, tiny loans to neighbors she never asked to be repaid, small donations to the church even when she could barely afford her medicine, secret gifts to families on our street when they lost work or fell sick. I traced my finger over the columns of numbers. Some pages went back 40 years. Each line was a story I'd never heard. Money tucked into birthday cards for cousins I barely knew. Grocery receipts with tiny notes, Mrs. Patel's boy needed shoes, $20. A single line that caught my breath, Rebecca's piano lessons, $30 a month. My name. I'd forgotten the piano. Forgotten the way I used to sit in her parlor, plinking out broken songs while she hummed along from her chair. I'd thought it was my parents paying for those lessons. I thought they were doing me a favor. But it had been her, scraping money from her tiny pension, hiding it from the family who thought she was hoarding worthless junk. I closed the ledger gently. On top of the last page she'd written, "What we give away is the only treasure we keep." The next morning, I called my office and told them I needed more time. They didn't argue. I think I wanted them to. I wanted someone to drag me back to the world I'd built, my apartment, my borrowed furniture, my empty bank account. But no one did. So I stayed. I woke up with the sunrise, wrapped in her quilt. I made tea the way she did. I spent hours in the garden, pruning roses the way I'd watched her do so many summers ago. My hands, so soft and pale from office work, turned raw and scratched from the thorns. I didn't care. Neighbors stopped by sometimes, quiet knocks at the door. They brought covered dishes I didn't need, condolences I couldn't quite hold. They lingered on the porch, peering inside. Maybe they could feel it too, the house's slow exhale, as if it were settling after years of secrets. One neighbor, Mrs. Patel, stood awkwardly in the doorway with a plastic container of curry. She was good to us, she said, eyes flicking to the tins and scarves on the table. Your grandmother. She never wanted anyone to know, but she helped when we first came here. Gave us money for the shop, told everyone to buy from us. I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. I pictured my grandmother in this very doorway, cane in hand, pressing an envelope into Mrs. Patel's palm. All while I called her scraps worthless. She never said, I whispered. Mrs. Patel touched my arm gently. She didn't need to. That's the kind of person she was. After she left, I sat alone in the kitchen. The ledger lay open beside my cold tea. I flipped through the pages again, trying to find some sign of anger, a line that read ungrateful granddaughter, nothing for her. But there was nothing. Just the numbers, the neat script, the patient lists of people she'd cared for. Underneath the last page, I found one more envelope. No name this time, just a single word in her careful handwriting, home. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A note, just for me. If you find this, it means you finally opened your eyes. Good. Now keep them open. Take care of the roses. Take care of the house. It's yours now, not just the walls, but everything inside them. All the things no one else will see if you don't. Keep them safe. Or don't. It's up to you now. No instructions about the money. No conditions. Just trust, sealed in an envelope she'd hidden like a seed beneath all her lists. I pressed the note to my chest and sat there in the fading light. I thought of my apartment, the gray walls, the cracked ceiling, the half-empty fridge. The life I'd built on borrowed money and half-kept promises. I thought of this house, old, stubborn, creaking with secrets, and the roses tangled over the rusted gate. When night fell, I stepped into the garden barefoot again. The soil was cool, soft under my feet. I knelt by the roses, pulled away dead branches, traced the roots of her secrets. I thought about selling it all, the coins, the pearls, the emerald brooches that glowed like secrets under lamplight. I pictured new furniture, a clean white apartment in a tower where no roses clawed at the walls. But when I closed my eyes, I didn't see that apartment. I saw this garden, wild and blooming, humming with bees. I saw the attic, the old chest, the dusty boxes. I saw her sitting on the porch with her cane across her knees, humming while I played piano out of tune in the parlor. I realized then, the inheritance wasn't the gold. It wasn't the coins or the pearls or the tins hidden in the soil. It was this house. These walls. The roses I'd once called weeds. It was the story she'd left for me to finish. In the weeks that followed, I didn't pack my bags. I didn't go back to my empty apartment, that hollow place I'd once mistaken for freedom. Instead, I stayed here, in this creaking house that smelled of lavender and rose roots and old secrets that finally felt like mine to keep. The neighbors came and went, leaving food I learned to accept. They told stories in passing, small things, dropped like breadcrumbs, how my grandmother sat up all night with Mrs. Patel when her son was sick, how she slipped envelopes through mail slots for families too proud to ask for help, how she'd sat on her porch every evening, rain or shine, humming songs that drifted through the street like a lullaby no one realized they needed. I started opening the old drawers I used to ignore. I found photographs hidden behind books, black and white snapshots of people whose names I never knew but whose eyes looked strangely familiar. I found birth certificates, marriage licenses, yellowed newspaper clippings about a war that felt 1,000 years away. She'd kept everything. Not just coins and pearls but stories. Proof that she'd lived 100 lives before I ever called her old. I found the piano under a sheet in the parlor, the keys yellowed but still soft beneath my fingers. I sat there at dusk, the same way I had as a child, picking out the songs I could half remember. Notes stumbled and fell, but sometimes, just for a moment, they rang clear enough that I could almost hear her humming along behind me. When I pulled back the curtains, the roses outside pressed against the glass, pink and red and wild. It was like they were trying to come in, to remind me they were still there, roots deep, blooms reckless and stubborn. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wander through the garden in her old cardigan, barefoot, feeling the soft earth give under my toes. I dug up a few more tins, though I knew I didn't need to. Each one felt like a last whispered joke, a final lesson. Look closer. Don't assume. Treasure doesn't always gleam in plain sight. The other relatives came sniffing around eventually, my uncle first, all forced smiles and too loud laughter in the doorway. "Well, she must have left something behind, huh?" he said, peering over my shoulder at the crowded parlor. I stood in the doorway, blocking his view of the chest, the tins, the old ledgers I'd hidden again in her sewing cabinet. I offered him tea in her chipped china cups, let him walk the rooms filled with faded doilies and stiff old chairs. When he asked about the house, I told him the truth, it's mine now. She left it to me. He huffed and puffed and promised to talk to a lawyer, but we both knew he wouldn't. He left with nothing but a stale cookie from a tin and a polite goodbye he didn't mean. I wondered what he saw when he looked at this place. Just a sagging roof, a garden too wild to tame, the smell of old age clinging to every wall. He didn't see the roses reaching for the attic window. He didn't hear the piano humming when the wind creaked through the parlor. He didn't feel her here, in the soft thrum of the floorboards beneath bare feet. One night, weeks later, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table long after midnight, the last letter she'd written open in front of me. Take care of the roses. Take care of the house. It's yours now. I whispered the words out loud, half afraid the walls would answer. They didn't. But the silence felt warm, like an embrace. In the morning, I called my boss and told him I wouldn't be coming back. I'd find work here, maybe teach piano again, maybe open the garden for neighbors who wanted cuttings of her roses. Maybe I'd start fixing the attic roof, the creaking porch, the loose tiles she'd always meant to patch. And when I needed money, I'd sell a ring. Or a pearl necklace. One piece at a time, not all at once, like a king's ransom, but carefully, the way she'd hidden them. Enough to keep the lights on, the tea warm, the roses fed. I kept her ledger by my bed, a reminder that a life isn't built in big windfalls but in small acts, quiet gifts slipped through mail slots and tucked under pillows when no one's looking. Sometimes I dreamed of her, not frail or stooped with that squeaking cane but young, strong, her hands deep in the soil, humming a tune I'd forgotten I knew. In those dreams, the roses never died, no matter how cold the winter, no matter how sharp the frost. In the end, the treasure wasn't gold or pearls. It wasn't the coins or the tins or the banknotes she'd folded into scarves I'd once called junk. It was this, roots tangled deep in soil, old walls creaking with stories, a house that whispered look closer every time I turned the key in the door. I used to think I'd outgrow this place, that the city's shine would bury these old ghosts. But I was wrong. Now, when the roses bloom so heavy they droop over the garden gate, I leave it open. Sometimes neighbors wander through, plucking petals, leaving secrets behind in the soft dirt. And when I sit at her old piano, the notes crooked but patient, I swear I hear her, humming somewhere just beyond the parlor door. I got angry at Grandma. And only later did I realize how wrong I'd been. But it doesn't matter now. Because she knew I'd figure it out, in my own stubborn, slow way. I was her girl, after all. And the treasure was never lost. It was always right here, waiting for me to see.